Can everyone hear me like this?
Yes.
Is that all right? All right, let me just get this going here. All right, lessons from Canada. We're in for a real treat to listen to Megan in a bit. And I feel really humbled and grateful to be part of the Scottish women's movement. It's super exciting to be here. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about something that happened in Vancouver and what was involved. So a bunch of us decided to open the Vancouver Women's Library in February 2017. What motivated us to start this library was a shared belief that women's writing is revolutionary, that feminist political theory can remake the world, and that it profoundly matters to preserve and record women's history. This idea is not new. In fact, this project was an homage of sorts to the unique historical relationship between women and books. We intentionally continued the second wave tradition of building a feminist movement through women-controlled communication and knowledge circuits in order to prepare other women in the larger community for action and to share strategies for altering the larger public. Feminist print culture historian Trish Travis argues that the surge in women's presses during the 70s and 80s was an attempt by a group of allied practitioners to create an alternative communication circuit, a women-centered network of readers, writers, editors, printers, publishers, distributors, and retailers through whom ideas, objects, and practices flowed in a continuous and dynamic loop. Women's presses, bookstores, and libraries were not intended to exist as isolated institutions, but facilitate a dialogue of knowledge and production amongst a larger network of women. As we know, this can't prevail within the already existing male structures of communication. The overarching concern amongst the dominant majority of book women was to facilitate a communications network free from patriarchal and capitalist control. Renowned literary critic Elaine Showalter argues that the work of feminist criticism, which she terms gynocriticism, begins at the point where we free ourselves from the linear absolutes of male literary history, stop trying to fit women between the lines of the male tradition, and focus instead on the newly visible world of female culture. The perhaps most radical contribution of feminist bookwomen was the aim of changing the way readers understood feminist literature so that reading became relational, became a call to accountability that required action. Resistance to male-dominated modes of production was the raison d'etre of most women's publishing and readerships during the second wave. Writer, publisher, and feminist scholar Ritu Menon argues that feminist publishing, almost without exception and everywhere in the world, came about as a consequence of the women's movement and acted in solidarity with it. She highlights that despite increased visibility of women's writing today, such as memoirs and autobiographies of celebrities and pop culture uptakes of authors like Margaret Atwood, feminist publishing as a whole has regressed into conflicting modes of production. She says that commercial publishing is interested in movement as market, not movement as resistance. When we think about publishing today and are comparing it to second wave print culture, we may also want to consider all forms of making women's words public, such as through Twitter, Facebook, and online journalism, and the way these platforms have control over the way we communicate with each other. Second wave feminists laid the foundation for a feminist readership of women where there previously was none. Deliberate calls for a networked movement happened through the strategy of print and publishing. In the UK, this manifested in notable publications such as the periodical Wires, which stands for Women's Information and Referral Inquiry Service. This was set up as an information directory of radical women's organizations, newsletters, academics, activists, books, and presses. Such periodicals were a reaction to the way women found themselves isolated and trapped. The public and private divide is central to any feminist analysis of women's lives, as women still struggle to participate in a public life that was always intended to benefit men through the subjugation of women. This realization led to the well-known second-wave feminist outcry, "The personal is political," which has been an essential part for arguing that the spheres of the public and the private are social constructs shaped by political power. Based on the experience and viewpoint of women, feminist politics have continuously recognized that the relationship of two, say the most dominant relationship of husband and wife, is a society. It is a public relationship, and it is regulated by the state. It is not an exempt sphere of personal liberty, but it is a political structuring of the personal. The women's liberation movement documented women's private existence in the public sphere through the writing and publishing of books, magazines, and periodicals, and through the organizations that enabled their distribution. Feminist print culture of the second wave engendered an infrastructure of decentralized collectivity, leading to a network of women's presses, publications, bookstores, and libraries. Such an infrastructure allowed women to find each other through reading and writing, and despite their differences, acknowledging what unites them and supporting a shared vision for a feminist future. Similar to the origins of the women in print movement, a growing urge for information sharing amongst women is surfacing today as a way of responding to the lack of understanding of the common denominator of the feminist struggle. This growing interest became apparent when it wasn't just myself and a friend interested in the idea of a women's library. Our group grew, and the library received international interest, including requests from women who heard about the project of a women's library and wanted to start their own localized chapters. It became clear that the idea of sharing books written by women amongst women was not isolated to our group of friends, but it was something that many feminists felt was lacking in their own communities. The momentum behind our experiment was unexpected and spontaneous. Little did anyone know how small in actuality we were, but this didn't prevent us from opening our doors and officially welcoming women to borrow books and spend time in our tiny space. So for several months before we opened it, the space was my personal weaving studio. It was situated within a larger gallery and grouping of independent artist studios, and as you can see, it was tiny. It was about under 100 square foot. We opened our doors in February 2017 with a collection of around 80 books written by women from our own personal bookshelves. During the first hour of opening, we were overwhelmed by the attendance of women who wanted to sign up and start borrowing books. Without warning, we were then met with fierce, persistent, and violent protests by about 24 trans activists who did not see themselves represented in the project. The group was loosely organized under the acronym GAG, which stands for Gays Against Gentrification. Protesters were stationed outside the entrance, preventing women from entering the library on a sub-zero winter night, and eventually made their way inside, carrying signs and shouting slogans such as "No TERFs, no swerfs." They distributed an open letter while they were inside, which claims that the Vancouver Women's Library is complicit in the deaths of trans women, and details a list of demands to be followed by us, central to which was the removal of around 20 books from our original catalog. They're the usual culprits or bad women, such as Catherine McKinnon, Mary Daly, Sheila Jeffries, Andrea Dworkin, and Janice Raymond. But then there's some more perplexing titles on this list, such as Joanna Russ's The Female Man, which is a sci-fi novel. Susan Murcott, who is a peace activist from the late 1960s in Boston. Tara Brach's Radical Acceptance, which is a self-help book based on the concept of mindfulness. And Adrienne Rich of Woman Born, which was a pioneering lesbian text that actually influenced early gay and lesbian scholarship, which is now titled Subsumed Under Queer Theory. We did have a suggestion function on our website, which could be used to anonymously submit titles for future ordering, and which was active before the protest. But it had not been used by the time the open letter was circulated. GAG did state that we are currently compiling a comprehensive list of suggestions that we will share, but then they added that this would only happen when the other demands were met. Those demands included the stepping down of the second co-founder and a restructuring of the Vancouver Women's Library Board of Directors, which did not exist. It's like there's no such thing as grassroots feminist activism anymore. Everything has to be incorporated, and it just shows the kind of that the people who wrote this letter had no factual understanding of how the Vancouver Women's Library was structured, and the list of suggestion of books was never received. They doubled down with the further claim that the Vancouver Women's Library enacts violence on sex workers by working to deny their access to resources and support. They work alongside the colonial government to pass bills that do direct violence to sex workers, such as Bill C-36. Now, Bill C-36 was introduced as a law in 2014, 3 years before the Women's Library opened. It supposedly criminalizes the purchase of sexual services, but the ways the Canadian government has done that is questionable. It's a whole other talk. But not mentioned in this open letter was the fact that we carried material and first-hand accounts written by women who had actual experience of being prostituted in the downtown east side. It seems a total non sequitur to accuse a free, independent library with a meager collection of 80 books of enacting violence against sex workers, when what we really did was provide literature on the empirical frontline evidence suggesting that men who buy sex cause the demand for women to experience sexual violence on a daily basis. That's not all. A further claim by GAG was that organizers refuse public conversations, won't engage with those who are directly impacted, and refuse to speak on the violence they have enacted with the library and organizing outside of it. Why don't we take a look at how we engaged?
I spent all of Wednesday speaking to Morgan.
Okay, get the fuck out. Get out.
Moving into the sex worker territory and telling sex workers that they are not human enough to make their voices. No tourists, no turfs.
No fucking turfs. Fucking neighborhood.
The full clip is online if anyone's dying to see the whole thing. So in covering this protest, Megan and Feminist Current brilliantly helped bring this issue into public consciousness, but Megan was unsurprisingly accused of dead-naming and misgendering the man who tore down the poster of Valerie Solana's Scum Manifesto. Protesters also poured red wine on books they disagreed with, they smoked inside, they pulled the fire alarm, and stole wine from our makeshift bar. Shortly after the initial protest, the outside of the space was spray-painted overnight with slogans "Class War," "No TERFs, no SWERFs," and "This space hates women." But they seem to have misplaced the hate because the fire hydrant is there. It just seems a little bit less. GAG did not comment on the graffiti, nor did they take responsibility for it or condemn it. The Vancouver Women's Library explicitly stated in our original mandate that we welcome all women regardless of creed, class, gender, race, or sexuality. But GAG has stated that this language is used by cis women as a move to innocence from their complicity in violence against trans women. It is used to mark trans women as other and center themselves again as victims of patriarchy. I actually agree with that last part. I think we should center ourselves as victims of patriarchy. So since this talk is titled Lessons from Canada, I'll share with you some personal lessons from this experience. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Far too often these protests and open letters are not meant to achieve anything progressive, but to frame a conflict of opinion as an abuse of power, and thus shutting down any form of debate. I've learned the lesson of not engaging in the small end of the debate, and not letting men take up my time with arguments that are purposely meant to distract us. I think we must also be wary of letting these dogpiling strategies seep into our feminist networks and influence the way we deal with internal feminist conflicts. And internal feminist conflicts are inevitable, but they're not necessarily destructive. In the best case, they can actually be constructive, depending on how we approach each other and the way we go about internal conflict is actually what I'm researching at the moment. So I think sisterhood is powerful, but sisterhood is also necessarily difficult if we're to take it seriously. This kind of pushback against women's spaces is strengthened by a growing uptake in pop culture of social justice rhetoric. And I think that this creates an immense guilt and pressure for isolated young women who are not allowed to center their own experiences. Demanding that certain books be banned from our collection also introduces some questions. As women, we should ask ourselves, do I understand the responsibility of what it means to be fighting for the liberation of all women? Is it important to me to learn as much as I can from the women who started this movement? Am I going to accept the idea that traditional male philosophers such as Plato, Nietzsche, Freud, and Foucault can be read critically, while feminist philosophers are deemed outdated and irrelevant? Am I prepared to let women's political theory become a pawn for cultural capital, to be dropped when unpopular, only to be referenced again during a slow news day? Will I rely on neoliberal institutions to provide the tools for women's liberation? Is institutional and cultural commitment to neutrality, equality, and free speech enough to achieve women's liberation? Supposedly all sides deserve to be heard equally, while staying neutral has become sought-after characteristic for public bodies and politicians. I don't think that's useful for women, because as feminists we know, neutrality is just another word for the male status quo. Asking for free speech in centralized corporate communication circuits is tricky, because free speech was never meant to include the revolutionary speech of women in the first place. I believe that as feminists we carry a responsibility to center ourselves in our own struggle, to be creative in the ways we organize and communicate with each other, to be unapologetically woman-centered, and to take advantage of this treasure trove of political networking strategy and experimentation that second-wave feminists have left us. We must situate ourselves as continuing, not reinventing, the larger historical project of women's liberation. And I'll leave you with this image, which is a quote from a member of the Vancouver Women's Library who wrote in response to the question, why do you need a women's library? For all the young women, all our daughters, who don't even know what they're losing, who don't even know their own history. They're coming of age, and their rage is growing. I hear their feet. They're coming.